The wind along the mountain pass cut through Anna's quilt as if it were paper. It hissed and curled around the wagon, rattling the boards, and found its way into the seams of her dress until her bones ached from the cold. The narrow trail wound upward between dark pines, their boughs heavy with stubborn patches of snow that clung to the earth even though spring had long been promised. The air smelled of damp earth, smoke carried from somewhere far away, and the faint tang of iron in the rocks. She kept her eyes low, watching her father's back as he drove the mule team with the same stiff set of his shoulders that she had grown used to. He had not spoken since they left home at dawn. Not a word about the weather, not a word about the road, not even a word about what was waiting for her at the journey's end. But Anna knew. She had known from the moment she overheard him trading words with a man at the feed store, his voice low but his meaning sharp. 2 sacks of flour. 1 mule. And her. Her fingers tightened around the quilt, pulling it closer to her chin. It was the only thing that still smelled faintly of home, wood smoke, lye soap, and the lavender her mother used to dry by the stove. Her mother had been gone for 3 winters now, and in her place had grown a silence between father and daughter that no amount of words could bridge. He had looked at her differently since then, his eyes heavy with the kind of disappointment that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The wheels groaned over a rise, and there it was, the cabin. Weathered split logs stacked tight, the roof patched in places with mismatched shingles, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from the stone chimney. It stood alone against the white of the slope, a dark shape carved out of the mountain. Beside the door, a man stood waiting. He was taller than her father, his frame broad under a coat of rough wool, a beard catching the frost like threads of silver. His eyes were pale, unreadable, fixed on her with the steady weight of someone accustomed to watching the world without hurry. A rifle leaned within reach against the wall, the wood of its stock worn smooth from use. He did not step forward, did not raise a hand in greeting, only stood, as still as the trees behind him. The wagon slowed, the mules snorting steam into the cold air. Her father climbed down without looking at her. His boots crunched in the frost as he walked toward the man. The two spoke in short, flat voices she couldn't quite catch over the wind. A nod. A glance in her direction. A sound like an agreement. Her father came to the wagon and reached for her bundle, a single worn satchel with all she owned now. He set it on the ground and, after a long pause, offered her a hand down. She took it because the ground was slick, not because she wanted his help. "You'll do as you're told here," he said, eyes fixed somewhere beyond her. "It's better than what you'd get elsewhere." Anna swallowed, her throat tight. He did not kiss her forehead or squeeze her hand. He turned back to the wagon, climbed up, and flicked the reins. The mules started forward, the wheels biting into the trail. She stood and watched until the sound of them faded, until all she could hear was the wind scraping through the trees. When she turned, the man, Caleb, she guessed, was already picking up her satchel. He did not smile or scowl, only lifted a hand in a small gesture toward the cabin door. She followed him inside. The air hit her first, warm, heavy with the scent of pine smoke and something faintly sweet, maybe dried apples. The floorboards creaked under her boots. A single table stood by the hearth, a tin coffee pot resting near the edge. On the far wall, shelves sagged with jars, sacks, and an old lantern. Everything was neat, but worn. Caleb set her bag by a narrow bed in the corner and stepped back. "Fire stays fed. Water's in the barrel outside. Wood piles behind the shed," he said, his voice low and even. Anna nodded, unsure if he expected a reply. She could feel the heat of the fire at her back, but the cold from the journey lingered in her bones. She wrapped the quilt tighter and let her eyes wander the room, the small window cut into the wall, the iron stove with its door hanging slightly ajar, the shadows pooling in the corners. He moved toward the door again, pausing only to pull the rifle inside and lean it against the wall. Then he stepped back out into the fading light, leaving her with the fire and the sound of the wind outside. Alone now, Anna let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. The cabin felt too quiet, too strange. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the quilt in her lap. Somewhere outside, an axe struck wood in a steady rhythm. She realized, with a heaviness that pressed against her ribs, that she had been left here, in the hands of a man whose face she barely knew and whose intentions were hidden behind eyes that gave nothing away. Whatever this life would be, she would have to find her footing in it, alone. The days fell into a rhythm Anna hadn't expected. There was no sharp bark of orders, no cruel remarks, only a silence that was not hostile but seemed to have been there a long time, like a piece of old furniture no one moved anymore. Caleb rose before dawn, the sound of boots on the floorboards waking her before the light crept in through the small window. By the time she sat up, there would be a tin cup on the table, steam curling from the black coffee inside. He never announced it, never waited for thanks, only set it down and went about his morning. When he stepped outside to check his traps, he always set an extra log on the fire, the crack of pine sap echoing in the stillness. Anna would wrap herself in her quilt and listen to the sounds of the forest outside, the muffled crunch of snow under his boots fading into the distance, the drip of melting icicles from the eaves. It was a world that moved slowly, without rush or chatter. She noticed his hands first, rough and strong, but lined with old scars, pale against the sun-browned skin. They were the kind of marks left by work, by accidents, by fights a man didn't talk about. Once, when she was sweeping near the hearth, she saw him in the corner of the room with a block of cedar in his lap, a carving knife in hand. The wood was shaped into the frame of a rocking chair, though it was unfinished, the arms still rough, the back missing slats. Draped across it was a wedding shawl, cream-colored and finely worked, its fringe tangled but clean. She didn't ask about it, but she found herself glancing toward it when she thought he wasn't looking. At night, the cabin's walls seemed to draw closer, the firelight deepening the shadows in the corners. One night she woke to the sound of a low voice. It took her a moment to understand it was Caleb, speaking in his sleep. The words were soft but unfamiliar, shaped in a rhythm that was different from English, carrying a weight of memory she couldn't name. She lay still, listening, until the words faded and the only sound was the wind against the logs. The next day, curiosity overcame her. What language was that? She asked while he was mending a leather strap at the table. He didn't look up right away. Cherokee, he said finally. My wife's people. Anna hesitated. Where is she? His hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then he said, gone. Some things a man can't set right. He stood and hung the strap by the door, the conversation finished. She thought of her own father, how little it had taken for him to decide she was a burden. How quickly he had agreed to the trade. She had been quiet all her life, slow to speak, slower still to please him. Her sighs had only added to the weight of his judgment. Here, in the silence of the cabin, those thoughts came back to her more often than she wanted. Still, there were moments when she caught something unexpected in Caleb, the way he would pause at the door in the evenings, looking back to be sure she had what she needed before he stepped into the dark, the care he took with his tools, sharpening them by firelight as though each blade was worth more than gold, the way he handled the coffee pot, never spilling a drop. It unsettled her. Her father's voice had been clear when he spoke of the man in the mountains, rough, hard, in need of a woman's work and willing to take it any way he could get it. She had braced herself for that kind of life. But Caleb's silence was not the same as cruelty. If anything, it made his intentions harder to read. She began to suspect his reasons for taking her in were not the same as her father's reasons for giving her away. Yet, that suspicion carried its own edge. Safety was a word she didn't trust easily. Here, it felt as if it might be true, or it might be the prelude to something else entirely. By late afternoon, the wind had turned mean. It swept down from the high ridges with a low howl, carrying with it a curtain of white that blurred the tree-line and swallowed the trail. Anna had fed the fire twice since noon, the logs snapping under the heat, but the cold still found its way through the chinks between the cabin logs. Caleb had gone out early to check his traps and hadn't yet returned. She told herself not to worry, he moved through this country like it was stitched into his skin, but the storm was growing, and even his long stride could be slowed by the drifts piling across the pass. The door banged open just as dusk pressed in, a rush of snow and wind tumbling inside. Caleb filled the doorway, his coat dusted white, his beard thick with ice. But he was not alone. Slung over one shoulder like a sack of grain was a young man, limp and pale under the hood of a deerskin coat. Caleb lowered him to the floor by the hearth with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the size of his hands. "Blankets," Caleb said, his voice clipped by cold. "Water." "The tin of salve from the high shelf." Anna moved without thinking, pulling the thickest blankets from the bed and kneeling beside the stranger while Caleb stripped off the man's wet outer layers. His skin was cold as river stone, his breath shallow but steady. She filled a tin cup with water from the kettle and set it within Caleb's reach, then climbed onto the stool to find the small tin of herbal salve, its lid worn smooth. The man stirred under their hands, a low sound escaping him, not a groan, but words in a language Anna didn't know. Caleb answered in the same tongue, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The stranger's eyes opened, dark and clouded, and his fingers curled weakly around Caleb's hand. They worked through the evening, Anna drying the man's hair with a scrap of flannel while Caleb rubbed the salve into frostbitten skin. The storm raged outside, shaking the shutters, but inside the air was thick with heat, the smell of pine smoke and the sharp tang of the herbs. Now and then, when the stranger's breathing eased, the two men spoke quietly in Cherokee. Anna caught only fragments, the words for cattle, for riders, for a place she didn't know, but the weight in their tones was unmistakable. There had been raids, or perhaps accusations of them, and the balance between the settlement below and the people in the hills was tipping toward trouble. When the stranger, Tayan, Caleb called him, slipped into sleep, Caleb sat back on his heels. His face was lined with something Anna couldn't name. She wanted to ask questions, but the set of his shoulders told her he wasn't ready to answer. The hours bled together in the flicker of the fire. Anna dozed in a chair, waking to stoke the flames when they sank too low. Once, she saw Caleb pull the blanket higher over Tayan's shoulders, his hand lingering a moment in quiet care. In that dim light, with the storm sealing them off from the rest of the world, the cabin felt different, no longer just a shelter of wood and stone, but a fragile barrier holding back the cold, the dark, and whatever waited beyond the ridge. And for the first time, Anna saw Caleb not simply as the man who had taken her in, but as someone who stood between worlds, carrying the weight of both without letting either see the full measure of it. Tayan's color returned in slow increments, like the thaw of snow along a south-facing slope. Days passed with him resting by the fire, wrapped in blankets, speaking little unless Caleb addressed him in that low, fluent Cherokee. Anna kept to her tasks, sweeping the floor, tending the kettle, bringing in armloads of wood, but the air in the cabin felt taut, stretched thin by something unspoken. The first hint of it came when Caleb returned from the settlement one evening with his jaw set hard. He said little over supper, but later, as she cleared the table, she heard him and Tayan speaking quietly. Words like cattle and men on horses reached her, enough to piece together that livestock had gone missing and blame was already circling like vultures. Not thieves in general, but Indians, spoken with that bite she remembered from her father's voice when he'd warned her about the hills. The knowledge settled heavy in her chest. If the men below learned Tayan was here, wounded and under Caleb's roof, their anger would not stop at his door. She had seen the kind of justice a mob could mete out, and how quickly it could spread to anyone caught in its path. The next morning, while she swept the ashes from the hearth, Caleb spoke without looking up from the leather strap he was mending. "If you go to town, you say nothing about him. Not a word. Understand?" She nodded, though her throat felt dry. It was a strange pull she felt toward Tayan, not trust exactly, but a splinter of doubt in the stories she'd been told all her life. Her father's warnings had painted a picture of danger and cruelty, but here, in the dim light of the cabin, she saw a man who met her gaze without flinching, who ate the food she brought with quiet thanks, who carried himself with a dignity that didn't seem born of deceit. And still, fear coiled in her. Not just fear of him, but of what others might do because of him. At night, the sound of Caleb sharpening his knife filled the cabin. The scrape of steel on stone was slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that got into a person's bones. She would lie in her bed, the fire's glow throwing shadows across the walls, listening to each stroke as though it were a word he wasn't speaking. One morning, after a restless night, she began braiding her hair. The act was small, almost foolish, but it gave her hands purpose, gave her a measure of order in the uncertainty. She wove each strand tight, feeling the pull against her scalp, as if binding something inside herself. When she stepped into the main room, Caleb's eyes flicked to the braid. He didn't say a word, but there was a softness there, a shift in the way he looked at her, as though he'd seen her make a choice, even if he didn't know what it meant. The days that followed felt like living on the edge of a thin ridge, with danger on either side. Loyalty and fear both pressed close, and she began to understand that Caleb's protection wasn't simply a kindness, it was a position that could cost him, and perhaps her, more than either had reckoned. The light was fading when the sound of hooves reached the cabin, steady at first, then quickening, the rhythm of more than one horse. Anna was at the table peeling potatoes when Caleb looked up from the firewood he was stacking. His gaze shifted to Tayan, who sat by the hearth mending a leather strap. No words were needed. Caleb set down the wood, lifted his rifle from its place by the door, and nodded toward the back. Anna's pulse quickened. She crossed the room, tugging at Tayan's arm until he rose. They moved quickly, the floorboards cold under her feet, to the trapdoor that led to the root cellar. The air that rose from it was damp and sharp with the smell of earth. Tayan didn't protest, only met her eyes once before disappearing into the shadows below. She lowered the door quietly, heart hammering in her throat. A hard knock rattled the cabin. Caleb stepped outside before they could try again. Through the narrow crack in the door, Anna saw them, 4 men on horseback, faces red from the cold, rifles slung at their sides. The one in front spoke loud enough for her to hear. "We're looking for the thief. Word is he came this way." Caleb stood square in the yard, his rifle in his hands but pointed toward the ground. "This is my land," he said, voice calm but edged. "No one comes inside without my say." The men shifted in their saddles. One spat into the snow. "You hiding something, Caleb?" "Only from men who think they can take what isn't theirs," he replied, his tone steady as stone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the leader gave a sharp jerk of his head, and the riders turned. Their hooves threw snow as they went, their voices carrying back on the wind, muttered words she couldn't make out, but the tone was clear enough. Caleb came back inside, closing the door with a quiet click. He leaned the rifle against the wall and sat down heavily in his chair by the fire. The glow caught in his beard, casting shadows up the lines of his face. Anna waited until she heard the last echo of hooves fade before opening the trapdoor. Tayan climbed out, silent, his eyes meeting Caleb's for a moment before he went back to the hearth. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet heavier than usual. Caleb didn't touch his supper. He sat long after the dishes were cleared, staring into the fire as if weighing something too big for words. Anna poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to him. He took it without looking at her, sipping once before setting it on the table. Then he spoke. "Your father thought I'd take you as property. I took you so he couldn't give you to someone who would." She froze, the words lodging in her chest. "I don't keep people," he went on, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "You're here because it's safer than where you were. That's all." For a moment, she couldn't speak. All the nights she'd lain awake, wondering what bargain had really been struck, what fate had been waiting for her, they shifted under the weight of those few sentences. The fire cracked, sending up a burst of sparks. She felt something loosen inside her, not trust exactly, but a thread of dignity she thought had been cut when her father handed her down from the wagon. Caleb finally glanced at her then, the light in his eyes unreadable. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. He returned it, just as wordless. In that quiet, something new took root, the first flicker of safety, and with it, the faint, startling sense that her life here might hold more than just survival. It might, one day, hold choice. The news came on the breath of a trapper passing through. Settlers were gathering, rifles in hand, planning to ride on Tayan's village before the week was out. Caleb's face was unreadable as he listened, but when the man left, he began pulling on his coat without a word. Anna watched him from the table, the knot in her stomach tightening when she saw him checking the rifle's chamber. "You're taking him back," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb gave a single nod. "Safer there than here, once they start looking." "I'm coming," she told him. For a moment he was still, eyes narrowing as though weighing her words. Then he gave a short, quiet shrug, as if to say the choice was hers. Within minutes, the three of them were outside, the cold slicing at their faces as they mounted up. The sky was a flat, hard gray, promising more snow before nightfall. The trail wound upward through drifts that reached the horses' knees. The air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, every breath a bite. They spoke little, the only sounds the creak of leather, the crunch of hooves, and the wind curling down from the peaks. By mid-afternoon, the storm came fast, a white wall sweeping in from the west. Caleb led them off the trail to a rocky overhang, its stone face sheltering them from the worst of it. They huddled close, the horses shifting restlessly as snow piled high against the open side. Anna's fingers ached, even wrapped in her quilt, but the stillness under the ledge was its own kind of refuge. When the wind eased, they pressed on. The trees thinned, and beyond them, Anna saw the first low shapes of lodges, smoke rising from their centers into the icy air. Riders appeared at the edge of the village, bows slung, eyes sharp. But when Tayan called out, their stances shifted, and they let the trio pass. In the center of the village, people gathered, faces wary but not unkind. Caleb dismounted first, offering Tayan his hand. The two clasped wrists, a grip that lingered longer than custom required, their eyes holding a conversation without words. Tayan spoke a few sentences in Cherokee, his voice low but certain, and a man nearby nodded in return. Anna stayed beside the horses, feeling the weight of unfamiliar eyes on her. She sensed no malice in them, only curiosity, a measuring of who she was and why she had come. When it was time to leave, the sun was slipping low, staining the snow with a faint gold. Caleb swung into the saddle, and she followed. The ride back was quiet, the cold sharp enough to sting her cheeks. Her braids snapped in the wind, and with each mile, the thought came stronger, she was not the same girl who had stepped down from her father's wagon weeks ago. By the time the cabin came into view, twilight had settled, and the light from the single window glowed against the snow. Caleb dismounted and turned to her. "You can stay," he said. "Or go. Either way, you decide now." She looked at the trail behind them, at the dark woods pressing close, at the cabin with its promise of firelight and the strange, steady safety she had begun to find here. "I'll stay," she said. Caleb nodded once, as if he'd known her answer before she gave it, and led the horses to the shed. Anna stepped inside, the heat from the hearth wrapping around her. Outside, the snow caught the last of the light, and the cabin's glow spilled onto it like a promise kept.